Let's talk a little bit about Scope 3 emissions. And these are perhaps the hardest for a manufacturer to tackle. I mean, these are the emissions by companies that you engage with up and down the value chain, such as your suppliers. So let's talk about suppliers. What are the raw materials used in Interface products currently? Just break it down for me.
There are a number of key materials that we use within our various products. And I think, so for example, for carpet, we've talked a lot about yarn. Yarn is a key material, and it's also a driver of carbon footprint for us. So that's a key material that we focus on in carpet. And then in rubber, we think about the natural and synthetic rubber and working with those suppliers to continue across the board, all of our raw materials suppliers. How can we reduce our impact in those key sectors?
Give me an example of a material that's been abandoned in favor of one that has lower impact.
All of the carpet that we made in Europe was backed with a bitumen backing. And as we move to this carbon negative carpet tile, we actually are completely off that bitumen backing in Europe and have completely transformed to standardizing our product on this Sequest backing. So that's that backing that has the bio-based material as part of that recipe within it. So no longer dependent on the bitumen for our entire European carpet operation.
Right. What about transportation? I mean, how, your suppliers are going to move products, and how do you get them to account for emissions due to transportation?
We have a very detailed life cycle assessment process where we work with our key suppliers and identify what are called hotspots. So where we can really drive the most impact, what is most impactful for a business. We have found that the raw materials themselves make up about 50% of our overall impact across the board. When we're looking at those scope 1, 2, and 3, across the board, most of it's coming from our raw materials. Transportation is certainly a piece of it. It tends to be in the 5-ish% of our overall impact. So it's something that we're asking our suppliers to be cognizant about, and we want to drive that lower. But we're really keenly focused on driving down impact within our materials as far as possible, as we know that's our biggest hotspot.
So much of what the suppliers do then has an impact on your final carbon tally. How do you go about selecting a supplier?
We have a code of conduct that we make sure that our suppliers sign on to, and that's ensuring that they're meeting all of our guidelines in terms of environmental needs, regulatory needs, all of those sort of make sure they're meeting the baseline of what is required to interact with Interface. But I think beyond that, we do have a process where we're looking at that life cycle assessment of the materials. So that's their impact, their environmental impact over their life. And we're selecting materials specifically that have lower impacts so that we can drive down our own impact, knowing that's where most of our impact comes from.
Right. But you are very reliant on suppliers being transparent in what they do in accounting for their emissions. How do you manage these conversations with suppliers in countries where regulations are lax or transparency is not the norm?
In areas where the regulations may not be as strict, I mean, we're certainly ensuring that they sign on to our code of conduct and are following that code of conduct. I think that we also want to have a very collaborative relationship with our suppliers. And so we have quarterly meetings with key suppliers and meet up with them to make sure that we're aligned on what they're delivering.
The requirements for transparency are not the same, for instance, as in Europe or parts of North America. And I'm wondering, for instance, what you do when you're dealing, say, in Asia. I mean, there are, you have manufacturing in Asia. How do you deal with suppliers in Asia?
We address this in a number of different ways. So sometimes as it might be the carrot or it might be the stick. So we try and work with our suppliers as much as possible, incentivizing them to give us more transparency and more data. So one of the ways that we do that is through that process that we've talked about, the life cycle assessment, where we're asking them to provide things like their emissions and their emissions attributed to us. That takes a lot of work. And so we've partnered to bring information to them so that they're educated on that and are incentivizing I should say we're choosing suppliers over other suppliers if they're willing to provide that sort of information. And if they aren't, then we're certainly open to looking to the right suppliers who want to work with us on driving down our impacts.
Let's talk a little bit about what happens with downstream management. So apart from sourcing, there's also the question of end of life. Products and materials, what happens when they are no longer in need? Yeah, I mean, there's a statistic that's quite shocking that over 4 billion pounds of carpets end up in landfills each year in the US alone. And so the question of landfills and waste, Interface has declared its commitment to divert waste by recycling and repurposing products, what was commonly referred to as a circular economy. What has Interface achieved so far on this front?
Our post-consumer carpet that came back through this process in 2022 was 4.3 million pounds. And that's in 1 year. So that's 1 year's worth of carpet that amount we're keeping out of the landfill. Very, very important. And I think the other thing to note about this is that this is highly reliant on customers returning that product back to us.
Right.
Because if we aren't able to get that back, then we can't make sure it serves a better purpose, whether that's reuse or recycling through our processes.
What will be the agreement like with a customer? Would you automatically buy back a carpet that you have supplied to them? Do they have to pay for removal of the carpet? I mean, there is cost involved in retrieval and managing it. So who bears that cost?
It depends. But I would say that if it's a great volume of carpet, then it's very worthwhile for us to bring that back down. We actually reuse this carpet in our own processes. So we'll chop it up into itty bitty pieces and put it into our backing. So it becomes a raw material for us.
Right.
That post-consumer content, we're interested in recovering that back. There are certainly logistical challenges, though, because, there might be borders that have to be crossed. And is it considered a waste material? We're certainly running against that in Europe, where waste can't be transported over border to border. And even though we might use it in our next process, is it considered waste? So that's sort of a tricky boundary to navigate. But using that product is interesting to us, and making sure it's at a volume or, further as we look at collaboration, is there a way that we can collect more in one place before it's transported back to make sure we aren't adding transportation emissions?
But is that a guarantee that's given to a customer at the point of purchase that if they decide to buy an Interface carpet, that Interface will down the road buy it back from them or take it back from them. What does that agreement look like?
We do agree that we will take back the carpet at the end of its life. And so after that, it's a matter of the logistics of getting it back. But I think what makes it particularly challenging in our industry is, someone might specify that will happen. And then, that may not be the owner of that space. Someone else may be moving into that space. And then the owner of that space, 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, decides that they're going to lease a different space, for example. Does the customer who's then moving into the space with our carpet or our LVT or rubber flooring then know where that came from and how we can return it to us? That part gets a little bit trickier because they may not know it's Interface carpet and that they can call us up and send that back.